welcome back, folks, to episode 4 of the Running Man Self Regulation and Self Improvement Project. What we're going to be discussing today is a really important topic, actually, and the idea of stigma is something that we hear about in the field of mental health generally, but more specifically applied to those that struggle with mental illness. And often, whenever we discuss mental illness, we tend to separate it many times from what we would call, in quotes, the normal population, or the population that is supposedly not afflicted by mental illness or mental health issues. The fact of the matter is, whenever we take a look at what mental health is, it's a very large umbrella under which mental wellness and mental illness, and both of those fall within the space of that umbrella. We have to realize this is a continuum, and whenever, it doesn't matter how functional, how optimally performing you are in your life and how you live your life, whenever we have loss, that could include loss of loved ones, loss of family members due to death, injury, illness, and whatever other permutations that life might bring. That is painful. Sometimes even losing a job can very often off-balance somebody to the point where there is a sense of depression, a loss of self-efficacy. I can't do anymore, or somehow I can't do enough, or somehow I've lost my capacity or ability to do things. This is something that we even see with our older community, in the sense that we start to get older, wind up, for instance, needing help with daily living skills, and we lose a sense of self-efficacy, and that could be very depressing over time, and it can make somebody question their value as a human being when you can no longer do simple things that before you needed no help with. Things like tying your shoes, or even buttoning a shirt, or even feeding yourself sometimes. But the idea of stigma often is a belief-based image that often we assume, and often is given to us by a general consensus. Society is a big term I don't like using, that's too general, and from the academic side of things is often overused as a whipping post, as a blame target, but also as something that's considered a general driver of beliefs that we all hold. Notice I said all, that's an absolute, and if you notice episode 3, we discussed absolutes and how that impacts our speech and how we communicate. And I'll try to minimize that today because we have to be very specific. When we're discussing stigma in particular, stigma associated with illness, mental illness, people groups, this sort of thing, we have ideas and beliefs that tend to separate and set aside. We tend to think categorically about things. Now, this is something I'm going to be sharing relative to teaching college students whenever I discuss becoming more of a critical thinker. Also understanding what categorical thinking is. Understand that we can put things in categories and itemize, label, name, and make sense of. That's a prefrontal cortex, higher cortical thinking process that we tend to do, but also it can be used as a comfort tool, in the sense that I belong to this group, you belong to that one. We tend to separate, create what would be the foundations of a prejudice of sorts against things, against people. And it's also by default an assumption, because there's a whole mess of ideas that goes along with a stigma, so to speak, that might require deeper thinking to actually tease and thresh things out, in the sense that we pull the details out of it and then we realize maybe it's not, as far as the stigma goes, particularly accurate, but yet it works whenever it's an expedient, meaning it hurries things along. It's an assumption. We as humans, by default, tend to try to save energy. Biologically and psychologically, even socially, we tend to do things that minimize our efforts to save our energies for things that are more important, like protecting ourselves, or doing something that's much more important, hedonically, something that gives us pleasure, maybe getting more food, or being able to fight, flee, and run if we must. So stigma, when we discuss it, as far as mental illness in particular, we tend to see people as people groups that are outside of, or somehow set aside, or outside of, in quotes, what we call normal, which is very demeaning, but also devaluing of the human being. Now, there are behaviors often that we associate with certain things whenever people are acting out, and those are the things that often fuel what we would call a stigma or a belief based on one's experience that stigmatizes individuals, and not just with mental illness, could be with criminality, could be with certain types of situations like teachers and students in school, among other things. And this can happen even at work or even at home based on behaviors and the discomfort that a person may feel. And often, whenever we act on these ideas, they tend to be very hurtful. So, this idea of stigma, once again, this is what we're going to be talking about. What kind of ideas do we have based on beliefs that are, one, faulty, two, not factual, and three, driven by an opinion that is emotionally founded, not necessarily highest thinking, reasoning, rationale. Now, we might throw some in there to support what we're doing because we don't like to change our minds sometimes. As people, as humans, as social beings, we'd like to maintain social value by doing what? Seeming or sounding like, looking like we might know what we're doing, two, sounding like we know what we're talking about, and three, not being wrong about what we're talking about. And once again, the gossip mill, if anyone ever involves yourself in that, you know that many people will not correct an incorrect bit of information that's passed along the grapevine, so to speak. No one ever goes back and say, oh, no, sorry, I was lying. Or I was incorrect, or I heard that and I assumed it was right because, man, they really made it sound good. And it was really compelling because of the emotional load and the facial body language, and they sounded like they knew what they were talking about, shifting blame to the person they heard it from. So it becomes this self-perpetuating loop of ugliness that makes an idea continue to roll. So this is something that we will return to in just a sec. The next thing is, well, what drives the stigma? Well, there is a belief that is underlying often, and it can vary because stigma isn't just one thing. We might stigmatize groups and individuals and things, people, activities, actions, and we tend to see that currently with politics, and we tend to set people aside because if you vote this way or that way, somehow you're less than this, that, or whatever. We tend to make these comforting assumptions because I don't like how you're voting. Um, so stigma can be something that can be very broad and occur in many circumstances, but all of these things are driven by a belief, an assumed belief that often is based on a very emotionally laden, emotionally founded opinion. And then we make a judgment based on that. And often, if the emotions are really, really strong, if they're particularly intense, and if they come on really fast within ourselves, this isn't counting someone else demonstrating something that would look particularly intense that we somehow mirror or assume that without question. But if it's within ourselves, often we might even use this as evidence, as support, so to speak, for what we're saying or believing, judging against, or even being prejudiced against, or to maintain that prejudice. And it is something that we maintain because of the intensity of the emotion. It's believable. It feels so real, it's got to be true. You notice how silly that sounds. That just means I'm not thinking, I'm responding from the field, but yet I'm acting as if I'm thinking with that. Or we do it so quickly that somehow we assume it's thinking and it's really just an overlay of pre-thought think, if that's a thing. So whenever we're discussing things and we assume things, we have taken the thinking out of thinking. One cliche that I really despise personally is when you assume things, you know what happens, right? You make an ass out of you and me. Why am I adding this to this? Because I don't like it. But the important thing is, whenever we assume things, it's not that you make an ass out of you and me. It's just that you're taking the thinking out of the thinking and using someone else's thought process that you kind of put together and use that as an overlay, as a template to do things. This is efficiency in disguise. In disguise of what? In the disguise of thinking, in the disguise of reasoning, in the disguise of rationale, or it would seem that. Often, when things sound rather pithy and astute and smart, we take those things as being somehow well thought out, and we assume that, well, those people are pretty smart. I guess I can trust this. Notice this is bringing up some red flags. It isn't me just speaking it, but this is an important skill, and this is a skill building podcast. We have to learn how to be self aware of these things, these drivers that often are the underlying aspects of those things that cause us the most pain in relationship. What motivated me to speak about stigma is that over years, talking to students, talking to people, peers, co-workers, patrons of organizations, patients, and people that I've done public speaking in front of, often their concerns and complaints. And I say often because I've spoken over time to several thousand people, not all at once. But the complaints are, I love what you teach. Where did you learn this? And you show me something. I understand myself. I know what's going on with me. I realize I'm not all effed up. There's nothing wrong with me. I've just had very difficult environmental circumstances, and those pressures have put me in a position where I have reacted and responded in ways that maybe I'm ashamed of, maybe I'm embarrassed about, but it was under duress or stress, and I wasn't at my best. And often these people will also mention that there was chronic stress, chronic stressors, of very ugly, traumatizing type things. And all I can say is, no kidding, you respond this way. No kidding, that's what happened. If your options are very narrowed, our options are going to be few as compared to whenever we have the wide open spaces of no pressure, assumption of safety met, and I have all the rationale and my reasoning available to me. That means that every possibility is there for me to think about, every probability. Well, I can weigh those out and determine which ones make better sense. But whenever we're discussing stigma, it is these negatives, it is these behavioral, I don't want to call them absolute failures, but failings to do those things that were expected, that were socially acceptable or social norms, so to speak. And those would have made easier transitions in those situations, but they were possibly or probably, it just depends, impossible to execute those things under the stressors that these people were speaking from. So taking this into consideration, not all behaviors are because we choose them, but rather sometimes the environment chooses them for us and that we have things narrowed. And part of it is because we believe it to be narrowed. And part of it is because we have the incapacity to use all of our capacity, all our potential IQ, all our memories, and all our reasoning and options. Our bestest of best skills is not online because if it's dependent on blood flow, and we discussed this in episode 2 in the hemodynamics of cognition, that means that my IQ dropped. That means by default I am physically stronger, but also intellectually a bit dumber temporarily till the stress goes away and the blood flow goes back to the front part of the brain wherever we have more of our ability to reason and to think within the past, present, future versus the immediate right now, stop the pain or run from what could be potentially hurtful to me. We're not in a reactive state. We can do more. When we're reactive, that limits what we can do and puts us into default settings. And this is where things can get very frightening. These are situations where people experience trauma or get traumatized or abused. This is also where we have memories that when they pop up, they can be very disconcerting because so damn compelling that they cause our body to respond as if. Now, we don't relive memories. People say they're so vivid that it's like reliving them. It's like, yes, but it's not reliving them. But our body is responding to that because it's so compelling, because it doesn't want us to go back and hurt again. It doesn't want us to experience that again. So it's going to make sure it's revving the engine and making sure that your protective mechanisms not only are on, but they're hot and ready to go. And if you're not running or at the very least physically moving away from where you're at or moving, like walking, and then this is where we start seeing things that look like panic and anxiety attacks because I feel stuck. And some people talk about freezing. Some do. But those that are able to move or pace, that at least speaks the language of the body, and that's emotion. It's not telling yourself, relax, calm down because it's safe out here. It may be assumed to be safe, and maybe someone is not threatening you. Maybe there's nothing threatening you in your immediate external environment. But if your body responds to something as if it's under threat, you have to react within that by giving yourself the suggestion that you can get away from the consequences of circumstances, even though it looks like everything's safe. Excuse yourself, physically move. It's when we don't that things get really out of hand. This is where we start experiencing symptoms that become overcoming and overwhelming, where we might vomit, might get upset, might get reactive, might start getting loud, might get hypersensitive to touch, may get twitchy, may start looking paranoid because we're looking left or right because our visual narrowing is occurring. I can't hear as clearly, and I start speaking loudly, and I might even seem abrupt or rude, and I might even be hunching my shoulders, what might look aggressive to somebody, when in actuality, our psoas muscle starts to fire, and that's a reflexive thing that causes us to duck when we're in fight-flee mode. Notice how I went through all of that at once. There's complexity. So if somebody sees this and everything is safe to whoever is observing, there's nothing harming you. This is what drives stigma. Things look a certain way, and we tend to believe them to be based on what they look like on the outside, without knowing what's happening inside, without knowing what happened in the past that's causing your inside to be so reactive now to things that otherwise would be considered safe. And assumed safe means that you're not in fight, flight, full tilt boogie, I gotta run, gotta fight mode. So stigma often is built based on observation that drives a belief. Now, Albert Bandura in the 60s, early 70s, he came up with an idea about vicarious learning, observational learning. You don't have to have somebody teach you how to do certain things. There are certain things, yes, that require a mentor and a teacher, but a person can mimic behavior and do things. Not unlike the 100 monkey studies that there were monkeys washing sweet potatoes, knocking the sand off before they ate them. And then that started to proliferate on an island, then to many islands. But that, it kind of indicates that we are mimics in our social situations. When things get uncomfortable and someone is acting outside of that, we tend to look at things from an us and them perspective. We tend to feel very isolated if you're the person experiencing the stress. We tend to feel like people are watching us, and they might be, but we tend to also cue to their eyes moving. And we tend to assume that they're looking at us or they're judging us, and notice that we're fighting with the reactivity and casting judgment based from a higher prefrontal cortical aspect and making narrative to make sense of what's going on because they feel so terrible, because they feel so uncomfortable. And then we become very untrusting, and people see us having behavior that looks like I'm disconnected, I'm isolated, I'm somehow different or set aside because my behavior doesn't match the rest of the group that is calm and safe because they assume their environment is safe, whereas this person is responding like it's not. Often the beliefs that we develop are based on observation, and we try to gather information. If there are those of us that tend to have a nurturing bone in our body, we may go up and ask if there's something we can do. Or if you're familiar, you may know, and you may be able to nurture and comfort or support this individual. But most people out and about, out at large, don't do that, can't do that, especially in this day of insensitivity. It is hard for us to reach out to others because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what someone's going to do. Allegations are very frightening for civilians and whomever. It's too easy. So it makes it even more difficult for us to connect with other folks. And we tend to assume it to be less safe now than whatever it used to be years back. We tend to assume that things are more unsafe now. That's a belief that adds to that isolation and separation that become more self-imposed versus imposed from the group, so to speak. So how do we change these beliefs? As we've been speaking about how the stigma develops and the beliefs come as a result of observation, not unlike Bandura talking about observational learning, we also, based on how we see things, come to judgments and narratives and try to make sense of things that otherwise would not make sense. We don't like hanging bits of information in our brain, not having somewhere to go, a category to fit in, so we can make sense of it and put it away so we can more efficiently and effectively move forward and deal with the next sweet potato or the next threat or the next mating situation or whatever that might be. So why is this important? The belief. Because often belief will not only drive the behavior, but also it can create situations that can become very difficult to stop, especially if people are engaging more than one, because then there is social value or social proof to a belief that may be supported by other people, especially if they're elders. And what if that's incorrect? Many people will default and say, oh no, it's just the culture. Oh, it's just them, it's just the individual. Well, those are cop-outs for real answers. Now, we don't want to go around disrespecting cultures and people groups and folks that we may esteem and respect, but we have to be willing, on behalf of ourselves and also our loved ones, to be able to ask the questions that are hard and be willing to apply what we'll be discussing in the Running Man podcast to ourselves. And hopefully you'll be able to share this, or at least be able to listen to this with your families. Many people that I've spoken to, whenever we've made sense of the symptomology, and they realize after years of diagnostic, and I'm not saying we've cured anything, all I'm telling you is that there are certain working diagnoses that people have taken medication for instance, but yet it takes the edge off of the symptomology, but it doesn't change the crappy thinking. Yes, I said crappy thinking. Often we can change our thinking, we can change how we believe, but we have to be shown how. And also what the result's going to be, and the result really is a higher quality of life, a better connections with people. If we understand that often whenever we blow our best attempt at communication, we realize, well, we're not really giving the best because I'm giving just, all I got, and that might be my best. But the potential optimization of that comes from understanding and compassion and knowing that we're deserving of, just like anyone else that we would consider at an arm's distance or outside of us, deserving or somehow healthier or somehow more normal or better, that they deserve, for instance, love, kindness, compassion, understanding, respect, and knowing that they're no different than us. Even though I might struggle with anxiety or depression or, for instance, schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or some other mood disorder, even though I might experience those things, if I have chronic stress and I feel like I'm going crazy or going nuts, and nuts and crazy are street terms, mind you, they're not symptomology. This is not what we treat. We do not treat crazy and nuts. Those are street terms that come from people that don't generally understand what illness is, mental illness, or what they're trying to describe as something outside of their knowledge as to why people behave a certain way. And crazy and nuts do not necessarily fall within the realm of mental illness, but rather even those that would be considered criminal or impulsive, but not diagnosed necessarily or even diagnosable, may do things that are crazy and nuts, but it doesn't necessarily make them mentally ill. Nor does that necessarily mean the crazy and nuts mean mentally ill. That's part of the stigma, is our flippant speech and the beliefs that are emotionally driven that drive and support those words and the ideas that we speak. So whenever we're discussing the understanding of those beliefs, we have to realize that sometimes beliefs are assumed when we're really young. Sometimes we learn them from people that nurture us and raise us, and there is an unspoken loyalty there, whether it be mom, dad, grandma, and we don't ever want to question those things, that we learn things really young, because it feels like we're somehow going against them or denying them or somehow shunning their love, or that somehow if we don't believe or say and speak the way they do, that somehow they're going to pull their love away, or their acceptance of us, or we're going to be outside of the group or the family. That's not always a bad thing. Sometimes where we grew up and who we grow up with are far from healthy sometimes. Sometimes it was good, sometimes it's bad, and there's some that were really good and there's no conflict there. But yet sometimes the belief may be incorrect. And it's okay to say that. Whenever we get into our teen years, we go through this period of differentiation where we start becoming our own self, where we start trying on personas and figuring out who we are. Am I the jock? Am I the cheerleader? Am I the academic? Am I the hero? Am I the soldier? Am I the criminal? Am I the bad A or whatever, We start finding what it is that is our personality niche, so to speak. And we start maturing in the direction of those things that would be us as far as our expression of who we are. And this is a personality, and therefore it's considered an adaptation to our not only environment, but also it's going to be later who we are recognized as far as self-image goes. Not true self, but our self-image that we interact with. This is going to be the mask of the polis or the mask of the marketplace that we use. This does not connote insincerity, but it's just a really good term. But it's also part of the social veneer that we work within, not the survival level. The social veneer has to do with the social level we interact with whenever all assumptions are met. Assumptions of safety, in particular, rather, are met. And this is how we interact and we get along with each other. So we try to get along with others to get along in our lives. And that is not copying out. Now, it can be that. But generally speaking, we're being socially acceptable, acting in a sociable way. So we have these relatively normalized, expected patterns of behavior that we can live with, that if we see somebody acting that way is not going to set off alarm bells out at the local market or the mall or wherever it is that we may see people. So beliefs. If I get my beliefs at a very young age, we have to realize that we don't have our bestest of our bestest, and that is terrible English. I know I do this to emphasize the bestest of our best reasoning. We don't have our rationale or enough experience to weigh things to know. And sometimes we are expected to just do what we're told. There are many times wherever we hear things that would seem absolutely ridiculous. That if you grow up like I did, hearing things that were like folk tales, but also things that were told to children to keep them in order and scare them into obedience and to keep them from putting their feet on the floor once they were put to bed, because things under the bed would get you this sort of stuff. We're understanding that that authority was being used to keep us safe because we don't want kids sneaking around. But at the same time, we were given a control method that was used to keep us wherever parents would know where we're at and prevent us from running around acting out or doing things or questioning things that we shouldn't be questioning. So if we understand that sometimes we were given beliefs and expected to follow them and be scared or respond a certain way, that is conditioning us to be safer and therefore making things easier for a parent to parent. They were trying to be efficient or effective. Now, not covering every possible possibility here. There are some that have been very nefarious and very traumatizing. I'm not discussing that. But I'm just pointing to the fact that sometimes we're given beliefs and we're expected to follow beliefs or believe a certain way, even if it's a religious, spiritual one. We're not knocking religious, spiritual, anything, but just making a point that sometimes we question when we get older and don't like and move away from the things that often are shoved down our throat, so to speak, or pushed upon us to the point of discomfort, and we lose much of our authentic self in that process, only to be found once we differentiate and sometimes we break away to be able to find that freedom to express self as who we are or how we are after the fact. So what about beliefs? Here's the question. So if there's a belief that supports stigma, that is unhealthy, the way to take it apart, to break that stigma, is by taking a very deconstructionist view My students often wonder why I ask questions in a deconstructionist sense. This is not destructive. Big difference. We're not destroying things. What we're doing is taking things apart like a mechanic. And we have to ask, well, when does a certain theory work? When do these tools that you're telling me about, asking questions about beliefs, work best? When don't they work anymore? When does it work best? Those are okay questions to ask, because this is how we start finding out more about things that are useful and start realizing that things that were, in quotes, traditional, that were being passed on by family members, often were passed on just because they didn't want to offend the prior generation or didn't want to run the risk of not being accepted. Just like the story that Bert Goldman talks about in his mind courses. He discusses the story of the ham and the mom that would cut the ends off of the ham historically, and her son gets married and asks his wife to make not a ham but rather a roast or something like this, and she knows how to make it, but yet he says that she's doing it all wrong because she didn't cut off the ends, and therefore there's something going to be wrong with what she's doing. So she goes to her mother-in-law, and husband watches, and they're both looking at why mom is cutting off the ends. Finally, he asks, "Why do you do that?" Mother answers, "It was because the pan was too small." But yet, they were treating it like this sanctified thing. Ooh, you don't not do that. You must cut the ends off because that's how mom does it. But yet, mom had a reasoning that was very practical, but in the tradition of being passed down, the understanding was lost until someone went and asked questions. Well, why do you do that? This is how we become more effective. Efficiency is one thing, but you can be efficient as all heck and not get anywhere. You can get so efficient that you freeze. And if your camouflage isn't wonderful, you get eaten. But if you're effective, knowing when to freeze is good. Knowing when to run is good. And survivability goes up, and you don't have to be the bologna sandwich, which is a really good thing. So, next thing, stigma. How do we break this? By questioning the beliefs that support it. Sometimes asking questions, why do we set people aside? Why do we think people are different because of? If you're observing somebody that seems to be struggling, of course, there may be a reason. And why is it that we set people aside from a certain people group? Well, those people think this way, or those people believe that way. Well, how do you know? Do you have friends, or do you talk to them? You got to be willing to question. And often people will say, well, no. Well, my mom told me, or dad said, or my friend said, or they saw him do this. Well, now that's secondhand information. And that is no longer along the lines of good Socratic thinking, where you ask, well, is it true? Is it helpful? And did you hear it yourself directly, or was it hearsay? Often beliefs are driven without question, and we have to be willing to question. Questioning isn't rude. This is one of the skills we must apply to ourselves. Why do I believe this way? Why do I feel this way? And we have to do so with courage, and that doesn't have to be rude. It doesn't have to be painful or punishing. We just have to be willing to say, you know what? This is really uncomfortable. And when I say this, I don't know why I'm saying this, or I don't know what supports it. It's okay to say that. It's okay to say, I don't know. You're not expected to know everything or to have every answer. And if you're moving under that idea, then we probably have to reconsider why I think that and what drives that idea that I must be right, I must be correct. Because that's a very precious way of living as well, which would fall within the idea of a stigma as well. So, how do we break stigma? Be willing to question, ask questions about why I see things a certain way. If you believe a certain way, that is judgmental and isolating of others. Now, this doesn't mean you're going to run into people that you don't like and turn them into likable beings. That's unreasonable. You're going to run into people you just don't click with, that's okay. But what we're talking about is the idea of stigma. So that way I don't get afflicted by that. And I don't afflict others by that. The more I can radically accept how people are, that doesn't mean I have to like what they're doing. Radically accept that by their nature they're human. And as far as I know, I don't know what they're going through. I don't know what their life is experiencing or having occur within that their experiences are negative or painful to them. I don't know. And it's okay, once again, not to know, but if we can suspend judgment, that means we're saving energy, we're being efficient. So we can be effective at, the question and develop beliefs that are more factually founded versus emotionally laden or driven. And that gives us a whole great deal of opportunity to understand. But this also takes that person away from this understanding that, oh, there's something wrong with them, or they're effed up, or they're broken, or somehow wrong fundamentally, and they're not. And we can accept them how they are. Then we realize that if they're mirrors of us, and what they do reminds us of something uncomfortable in us, and that means I'm kind of human too. We're not infallible. This gives us a lot of room to have compassion for others. It's easy to say away from us and those people out in our world that we see and interact with. I love you. I'm sorry. Please forgive me and thank you. That's easy to do out there, projecting it and directing it towards others. But it's really hard to do towards ourselves because often we're our most harsh judge, more so than even with others. And it's hard to tell myself, I love you. It's really hard to tell myself, thank you. It's really hard to say, please forgive me. I didn't know what I was doing, or maybe I should have known more, or I should have waited. I have to give myself a benefit of the opportunity to forgive myself, because I'm not perfect. This does not give you permission to go and make mistakes on purpose and to say, forgive me. Not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is being able to genuinely forgive yourself and be able to say thank you. Thank you for breathing, keeping me alive, protecting me. Even when I have this anxiety attack and it sucks, be able to say, you know what, I know you're trying to protect me. It's okay. I understand. I don't like it. It doesn't feel good, but it's going to be okay. It's going to pass soon enough. Whenever we can take the opportunity to direct that towards ourselves, and we realize that other people are mirrors of us, and accepting them is easier than it is accepting ourselves, but we can't run from our head. All those little things that we've done, things that we've seen, things we've experienced, traumatic or even dark and kind of embarrassing to us, those are the things that are memories within us that we use to keep us from accepting that grace of love, I'm sorry, apology, accepted towards ourselves, and even just flat acceptance of ourselves as human beings, a radical acceptance of the fact that we're human. And that is one of the things that helps us break stigma, by being willing to accept. That doesn't mean like, doesn't mean love, doesn't mean judge. You're not judging. You're just accepting things how they are, accepting people how they are, realizing that by their nature, they're human. That me, as a human, I'm equally as fallible and equally as capable as people doing really good or people doing really bad. We all can. When we think of ourselves as beyond the ability to do anything like that, I could never. Well, you're speaking in absolutes. You've already taken it to the realm of ridiculous because we're human and we can't ever experience an absolute in the truest sense. We'll never experience an ever. I'm always and everybody, everything, everyone, everywhere, all the time, ever, never, forever. We just won't. So when we take the exaggerations out, we speak factually, we speak powerfully to ourselves, and that is where the transformation of self becomes possible, where we become better, where we relate better, where we communicate better, and we also inflict less discomfort and pain on others, not meaning to. Also, if we can talk about this, people start understanding that it's not because you're wrong or you're broken, but because the stress in the environment, and the chronicity of that, or there's something going on inside. And we have that room to understand. We also have room for compassion for the individual and for others, which also means we'll have patience with them too. So once again, stigma is broken by being willing to ask questions. And by asking questions, we start even questioning beliefs that support a stigma that may be based on things that aren't true, emotions, and judgments and opinions that are emotionally driven versus actual facts, which give us room to be compassionate and accepting of others. This is where real growth starts to occur in ourselves and in our communication with other people. That's been a lot in a little bit, and I want to tell you thank you for listening if you've listened this far. And we're going to be discussing more details. Probably not going to run as long as we did today, but what we're going to do is be working on things that are actual skills that you can start using and adding to what it is that you do to improve your quality of life and to gain a higher quantity of those quality life relationships and bettering those that you have and improving those or enhancing those that you're just developing now. So for now, thank you for being here, and I want to tell you thank you again for just listening. Any comments, please leave them below, but also just like and subscribe and share this with family. We'll be getting into some more comprehensive ideas as to how do I speak to family whenever there is stigma or belief, and how can we listen so we can understand better and be better partners, brothers, sisters, parents, spouses, friends, co-workers, and just people at large.